Hey there, welcome to the Being Human podcast. I am your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I'm excited to dive a little deeper into this idea of pride and identity. We started this off in the last episode and are opening up this idea that we have a lot to be proud of. If we really know who we are and we really go deep into the truth of our identity as created by God in His likeness and image, fallen away from His likeness, but still in His image and redeemed to be restored totally into His likeness. There's so much to be proud of. And so in this month of celebrating the most sacred heart of Jesus, also this longing for, even in the guttural cries of culture, looking for something to be proud of, celebrating pride in something. We want to give the answer, what can we really be proud of? And we have it. We know we are created in the image of God and loved into existence, our very being loved into existence. And this is the most Catholic, deep theology possible. This has been centuries of both theologians and philosophers and the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and all the saints and angels who are in touch with the Trinity have been trying to get us to understand this is the most important, deepest point of our life here on this planet. And this is what we drink in from the wealth of Catholic theology and spirituality. But that's really confusing because that's not what most Catholics think. That's not what most Catholics are stereotyped. How do we have Catholic stereotype? Catholic guilt. Oh, we're supposed to engage in self-flagellation, whipping ourselves and crying out of pity and crawling to the confessional and just thinking about how bad we are as Catholics and all this stuff. How did there become such a divergence between real, actual Catholic theology and spirituality, which is literally centuries of God trying to tell us how good we are, and Catholic guilt? That's what we're going to break open today in this episode. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast. All right, so Catholic guilt and the truth of our identity. This is something that I love talking about because I work with a lot of people who are very faithful Catholics. And not exclusively, but just happens to be the case that ends up becoming a good percentage of our audience, our client base. And for as faithful as most Catholics are, who are in that sort of category, of orthodoxy or whatever, I find that people really don't get the point about how much we are loved. And it still hangs in the cultural mindset that we are supposed to feel guilty and like we're not doing a good job, and then that spills over into mom guilt and dad guilt and kid guilt and job guilt and life guilt, and it's this constant like we're not doing a good enough job and we have a lot to be guilty for. We talk about sin and how it drags us down, and we're so guilty of all this sin. Where's the truth in all of this? How are we going to find our way to understand how it can still be true that happiness and holiness will come from understanding our truest identity, the deepest core of our identity, which is that we are made in His image and we are loved into existence? That our very being existing is the consequence of being loved. The mindset is we have to earn the love of God. We have to earn a place in God's relationship. And because we're not good enough, then we're guilty, and then we're not in relationship with God, and so then we're really miserable. So if only I pray more rosaries, if only I cut out all the sin from my life, if only I perfect myself and become perfected and do everything perfectly, and whatever that is in your own sort of situation, will you be loved? Or you're doomed to not be loved because you're not going to make it. You're not going to be a perfect mom. Your kids are still a disaster. They're still screaming and fighting with each other at church. They're still beating each other up. They're having trouble in school, having behavioral issues. You're fighting in your marriage. You are whatever, XYZ, you name it. And so therefore, there's no chance to be loved by God, to have a fulfilling, actual, loving, satisfying relationship with God on some level. What are we supposed to do with all this? We have a misconception about guilt, and I want to clear this up once and for all. And I partly recently blame Brene Brown. Okay, so I love all of her stuff. I love, her books. I love her TED Talks. I've looked at all her stuff. I use some of her videos and when I'm doing presentations. It's amazing stuff. However, she's piggybacking on a very cultural misconception of a distinction that I hear all the time in so many different places between guilt and shame. This is like the big hot button topic for what Brene Brown does. And people have this idea that guilt is about what you do, and shame is about who you are. And it's this really artificial, secular, contemporary breaking apart of these two concepts. And while I do think that there's value to that distinction, in fact, there's a lot of value to the distinction of understanding, the difference between who you are and what you do. That's not helpful when it comes to understanding guilt, because we should still have guilt, and we also should have shame. But the reason why I'm saying this is because shame, when it's unhinged from this cultural superficiality, and when guilt is unhinged from this cultural superficiality, we go deep into the biblical truth that goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. What is the word that's used in the book of Genesis? What is it that John Paul II talked about? I think it's over 100 times using the word shame in the theology of the body. Shame is in the book of Genesis. They were naked without shame, and they felt shame. And it's all throughout the Old Testament. Shame is what David felt. Shame is in the book of Sirach. Shame is this experience of being human and being off track. So I want to come back to our deepest, truest identity. We are made in the image of God. We are made for an eternal destiny to be united to God. And I've talked about this elsewhere. This means actually to be divinized. This means to become God, with God, in union with God, through Jesus Christ, of course, as creatures, but through union with divinity, actually receiving what is of God and becoming God's. And whenever I say that, everybody, not everybody, some people go up in arms. You can't say that. Like, all right, well, we're not doing apologetics here. It's for another time. But all you have to do is do a simple Google search about this concept of divinization, and you'll see that this is right out of the church fathers. This is not an idea to be held in doubt. This is actually what we're made for. It's almost too good to be true. Well, I totally get where the doubt comes from. Well, that's what we're made for. So we're made in his image to return to him through Christ, to be in union with divinity for all eternity. Because of concupiscence, because of original sin, we have lost all of that inherent natural inclination and that ease of life, of living in a total orientation to what is true, good, and beautiful, those transcendentals of God. What is true, good, and beautiful. In the Garden of Eden, before the fall, we walked in union with God with total peace and ease of everything being totally true, good, and beautiful. Everything of our human action, everything that arose from us, everything was moving us towards what is true, good, and beautiful. And then comes original sin, because we still had freedom in that true, good, and beautiful walking with God in the garden. And because of original sin, we suffer concupiscence. We are ripped away from that ease, still being in the image of God, but now not in his likeness, until Christ restores the bridge. So what do we have to see here is this amazing safety this amazing survival instinct, spiritual survival instinct that God builds in to our human constitution. Our anthropology is shining a giant light on our conscience. Our conscience, when properly formed, in line with the truth of human integration, so we're developmentally growing throughout our lifespan, increasing in our faculties of intellect, our rational abilities, our abilities to pray and discern and be in union with the Holy Spirit as we receive more and more graces through the sacramental life, we are growing in our ability to have a conscience and discern and think about and feel. This is where it's really important, because a lot of times we throw the baby out with the bathwater and we get rid of emotion thinking that's not important for the spiritual life. But if it wasn't for our feelings, we wouldn't have the pang of conscience, the conviction of the Holy Spirit that actually changes our hearts to want to do better, to move towards God when we're not moving towards God. So because of concupiscence, we become disoriented. We're moving away from what is true, good, and beautiful. And conscience is what reorients us and moves us back towards what is true, good, and beautiful. Gets us back on track. In other words, it is why we feel shame. Why we feel shame. So think about this. Because we're so good, we're made for eternal union with divinity. We feel shame when we are reoriented, misoriented, misdirected away from what is true, good, and beautiful. So think about how different is that from this secular, superficial conceptualization that shame is about who you are and guilt is about what you're doing. No. Let's erase that. Let's take that away. If we're gonna really understand how to heal this chasm between Catholic guilt and our true identity and nature, we have to first step eradicate this false dichotomy between guilt and shame created by the secular culture that has no idea why we would even understand ourselves as good to the core. You know, it's nice to throw out the idea, and it feels good because it does resonate with what's true, good, and beautiful in the depths of our hearts, ironically. If we don't actually pin it to a biblical origin and the revelation of Christ, we don't actually know why we would even be good. It's just a good guess. It sounds better than not. But we know why, because we're made in God's image. God is love. And love consists in this, that we are loved first. We're loved into being. God's loving us is the first action, and then we exist, and then we respond by loving. We love in response. We can never earn something by loving God, because we're already infinitely loved. Before we exist, we're loved into existence. So that means that we don't even have a chance to earn something better by loving in return. What we're doing is orienting our own human development in line with what is true, good, and beautiful. Because when we receive God's love and respond to it, we are opening up this channel, this flow of receiving and giving back, this beautiful synergistic cycle of love, which is to be in relationship with the divine, which never ends. You can never get enough because he's eternal. So it will always be opened up like that. That's what we're made for. The gears crunch and crack and squeak and come to a grinding halt sometimes even. Or we just get some dirt in there, you know, and we need to clean things out. But the guilt, the shame, it's one and the same. And it's the sense of self that we are not lined up with what we're made for. So instead of Catholic guilt or shame being a negative thing, we have to see the underlying positive, the implicit silver lining here. The fact that you feel shame is because you're so good. The fact that you feel guilty is because you're so good. You see, if we first take away this false dichotomy, we put them both together, we recognize that whether we're talking about guilt or shame, they're two different words for the same thing. They both have to do with who we are and what we do. It's because of who we are that what we do might not be right, and it might be lining us up with what's not right, which is not lined up with what's true, good, and beautiful, which is who we are is actually made to be in union with. So again, it's one and the same. We reorient. So when that pang of guilt comes, that conviction of the Holy Spirit that makes us feel something negative, the only way that that is of God is if it is immediately putting you back in line with turning back to the Father to receive his mercy, to fall down at his feet, to let our head crumple down in his lap, to let him embrace us in his arms and console us and say, there, my child, my daughter, my son. I know you can't do it on your own. And I'm so sorry that you just tried to. But you silly kid, you're not going to make this without doing it my way. You silly child. Come here. Let me love you. Let me fix you. Let me heal you. Let me clean your wound. Now stay in my lap. Don't keep leaving. Stay with me. That is what guilt is for. Okay, that's what Catholic guilt should look like. So, how did we end up so far from this reality? Because we don't like ourselves. And we have things inside of ourselves. This is piggybacking off the last episode that we don't like in ourselves, things we find in ourselves. Because when we're growing up, we receive lots of messages, lots of negative messages, because the people around us maybe don't like parts of themselves, maybe don't like some things that we're doing or that we might bring to the surface for them, or it brings out frustrations, it brings out the need for suffering and sacrifice and laying down one's life for someone else. All these things are part of childhood, and then children receive these messages that become internalized, and then we develop these parts within ourselves which speak with these voices of negativity, of self-criticism, of shame, self-shaming voices, self-rejection, self-hatred. And then those voices, well, they want justification. They're there because they're protecting you. It's like, oh, this is what I have to do to stay in this environment. I have to be negative towards myself. I see that's what mom's doing. That's what dad's doing. That's what brother, sister is doing. That's what teacher's doing. That's what uncle's doing. That's what neighbor's doing. People are being negative towards me. Okay, well, if I want to be here, I'll be negative towards me. Like, I'll develop this part that knows how to fit in by having this negative voice. What is it doing? It's protecting you. It wants you to fit in. It's doing its job. It wants to stick around. And then all of a sudden, you start to learn the faith, you learn the rules, you learn morality, and then those parts are like loud and proud. They're here to show, see, I knew there was a reason why you're not good. This is it right here. Now we know. We've got it. It's even got a number in the catechism. This is why you should feel guilty. This is why you should feel terrible about yourself. This is 99% of people who I talk to's version of Catholic guilt. Think about how far off that is from why we are made to feel guilt and shame. It has nothing to do with it, with God's purpose for guilt and shame. God's purpose for guilt and shame is to reorient us like a compass when we've fallen off track. We are on a ship that is made for paradise, and we are on the way to paradise. And when we're sailing with the right winds and on the right track, we're on the right trade route, the sun is beautiful, and even if it gets stormy, we never lose faith and heart, and we have all the consolation that we need, and we're on the right track because we're going in the right direction. And then when we blow off course, we're going in a different direction. The compass starts to light up and shake and make noises, and it starts to raise these alarm bells, and it's like, get back on course, you're made for better than where you're headed right now. So that's when conscience, through guilt, reorients us back on track. Thank God for guilt. Thank God for shame. This is what he made us to be able to return back to him with, because he loves us so much. I mean, he really pulled out all the stops. He's figured out every single angle to try to get us back to be in his embrace. And this is one of these really creative ones. It's like, okay, I have to give them free will because love has to be a free choice and they can choose to do wrong. So then what happens if they choose to do wrong? Well, we can give them an internal compass. It's going to bring them back to us. That's amazing. That's so creative. That's brilliant. So this is where we're at. This is how we can understand the difference. This is why Catholic guilt is mostly understood incorrectly. This is why guilt and shame are really not different from each other. This is why guilt and shame both have something to do with who we are and what we're doing. And if we understand and recognize the way God made us and how he built us to have this internal compass back towards him, even when we do something wrong and feel guilty about it, we can understand our own goodness and feel the consolation of knowing that we're made to be buried in his arms. And that guilt is to be understood as a reminder that we need our dad, that we can't do it on our own and we're not made to do it on our own. That our dad is with us, waiting for us, and that he's here to take us fully in his arms no matter what, as soon as we but glance back in his direction. All right, I hope this has blessed you. I'm really enjoying this little series on identity and pride, and I think that where there is cultural confusion and a lot of things coming off track opens up just awesome opportunities for us to talk more about being on track. God bless you. Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.